Today, I'm going to answer the question if Trump is a narcissist. I hear a lot of people saying this, and I think it's an important question for several reasons. One is it's helpful to clarify and define exactly what a narcissistic personality disorder is. See that term used a lot online and in conversation, and I think it's often misrepresented. It's also important to understand politicians like Donald Trump. And Trump himself provides insight into the contemporary right wing part of the Republican Party and of right wing politicians around the world. So, the key aspects of a narcissistic personality is one is a constant need for approval, another is underlying insecurity. So, what drives that need for approval is that the person does not feel secure in their own self, their own identity, their own beliefs, or their own values. And so they need other people to verify what they think and believe. Another defining aspect is the inability to tolerate any criticism. And part of this has to do with the fragile self, the underlying insecurity. Um, but there's also this underlying desire for unconditional love, understanding, and recognition. So Freud says when the young child, when the baby cries and the parent responds and gives the child what it wants, the child develops this lasting, unconditional desire to be understood, to be recognized, and to be cared for. And so he argues that behind every demand, so even if a child asks for, say, a drink, there is this fundamental desire. They're not just asking for the drink, they're asking for love, understanding, and recognition. And part of the narcissistic personality is this need to be seen as good with good intentions. And Freud argued in relationship to obsessional compulsive narcissism or neurosis that there's a constant effort to shout down bad intentions or negative feelings and to see oneself as being good and have others recognize oneself as being good. And this results in inhibition of drives. Now, it's better to think of Trump as a borderline personality and not a narcissistic personality. First of all, he's not driven by insecurity, and he doesn't necessarily want to be seen as good or having good intentions. Um, the fundamental fact that drives borderline personalities is inability to control drives, and that these drives are fundamentally antisocial. And so, antisocial greed, when that's a dominant character trait, is often an example more of borderline personality and not narcissistic personality. There also is, because it's self-driven and self-interested, there is a rejection of social sharing or social sacrifice or social regulation. In fact, any call for someone to, say, sacrifice by paying taxes or by sharing their money with other people is seen as a form of castration, a threat to the self. And so what is set up here is this opposition between the id, the part that is the selfish drives, versus the social superego, the conscience, or the social values. And what we see in Trump, but what we see throughout contemporary society, is this notion that you can become addicted to money, to power, to admiration. And so there is this kind of addictive nature. And if we think about addiction, this is probably the purest aspect of borderline personality. It is often self-destructive. It often undermines social relationships. Someone tries to stop it, but they can't stop it. So there's this compulsive, impulsive act in addiction, and that you can become addicted to almost anything. And that's one of the things that differentiates us from other animals who have instincts, which are pre-wired to desire a particular object or a particular image that triggers it. For humans, they can become addicted to virtually anything. And so we think about this in political terms. We need to think about this as libertarian, not conservative. Conservative is the attempt to conserve the social hierarchy, usually by a strict belief system, often a patriarchal system with a clear social hierarchy. Libertarian is almost the exact opposite. There's this underlying desire for total freedom and enjoyment. And often there is a lack in the borderline personality, which we also seen in libertarian politics, a lack of shame, inhibition, or guilt. And we can tie this to the terrible twos, as we call it, and when a child is around 2 years old and they're first developing their sense of self, they're trying to separate from others, to individuate themselves. They often say no to everything. And so there's this fundamental selfishness, but also kind of a rejection of others. So one question is, how do you deal with borderline bullies and people like Trump? Well, one thing that we know in analysis is you have to set limits. There has to be consequences. And so as long as someone like Trump keeps on getting away with what he's doing, his criminal activities or his breaking with democratic principles, he's going to continue to do it. And so you need some type of consequences, you need limits. But in analysis itself, through free association, you hope that there will be established a conversation between someone's impulses and their emotions and their reason, their understanding. One of the things that makes Alcoholics Anonymous work is that there's this group confession, and also one has to surrender to a higher power. Now, this is very different from analysis, and it works for a lot of people, but analysis says the surrendering to a higher power is a form of transference, meaning that you kind of transfer responsibility and power over to the other, whether the other is God or the group, and you never really fully develop your own sense of responsibility. So a key to dealing with borderline bullies and addiction is that often they have to hit rock bottom first, in a sense that a lot of people come to analysis or therapy after they've run into a problem with the law or with an important relationship, and they're kind of forced to go. And they realize on some level that if they don't get help, they're going to kill themselves. They realize the self-destructive nature of their addiction, and so they come for help. But once they come for help, the analyst can't be there as a savior. And so one of the things that an analyst does in psychoanalysis is they don't respond to the demand because they want the fundamental desires to emerge. They want what's below the demand to emerge.